Joining us now to discuss this even further is Bill Roggio. He is with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Bill, good to see you.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.
All right, so let's just start with this. Some of the key takeaways when it comes to that meeting just yesterday.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it was positive. Zelensky's tone was very different, and as well as President Trump's tone were very different than the meeting earlier this year, which was extremely acrimonious. So that was a positive step. I mean, Zelensky even went through the extraordinary measure of putting on a suit, and I'm not making fun of that. But he was clearly making an effort to impress President Trump. Now, that being said, I still think the two sides, Ukraine and Russia, are wildly there's a vast chasm between the two. Russia wants territory. It wants the rest of Donbass in exchange for peace and a ceasefire, which we can't even trust the Russians to pull off. And Zelensky's unwilling to yield territory, which is understandable because his government would collapse. And I don't think there's any Ukrainian government that could survive ceding territory to Russia. So, you know, the talks are good. It's a positive step in order to move forward, but I'm just not sure how this chasm could be bridged between the two sides. Zelensky is already talking security guarantees when the Russians don't want NATO troops inside of Ukraine. Look, whatever people think about the reasons for Russia launching this war, that's what the Russians claim is one of their reasons for its invasion. It doesn't justify it, but their concern is NATO encroachment. And I don't think this is an issue that Putin is going to yield on.
Another point that we have been talking about really is the fact that, you know, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, he can't really make these decisions, specifically when it comes to these territories in Ukraine without the support of Ukrainian people. What kind of support is he getting from citizens down there on the ground? What are their thoughts on this whole thing? Because so far, Zelenskyy has said that he is not going to do that. But at the same time, when negotiations come, there's going to be some give and some take.
Yeah, it's difficult to know, and we have to rely on polling. And the only polling I've seen on this is that well over the high 60s percentage of Ukrainian people support peace. But would they support peace with a land exchange? I haven't seen any polling information on that. I get the impression that most Ukrainians, probably the majority, wouldn't support that. But again, I'd like to actually see those numbers come through. But what's even more crucial is what would the military think about that? And particularly, what would more of the right-wing military units, such as Azov and other units that have a deep past with right-wing extremist past that have threatened the government in the past, these are groups that are not going to accept any type of deal that would cede territory. So it's difficult to know. I would really like to see more information coming out on what the Ukrainian people would support.
Apart from the meeting that was televised for the world to see between President Trump, Zelenskyy, and the Ukrainians, we know that President Trump was going to have a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin right after all of those talks ended. Do we know how that phone call went? What exactly were those talking points like?
No, we don't have a good idea of how the intricacies of the phone call went, but we can go on the public appearances, and everything does seem to be going well, at least publicly. So that is a good sign. I think Trump's meeting with Putin, went well. Trump's meeting with Zelenskyy went well, all based on appearances. But in any type of negotiations like these, the devil's in the detail. I'm always looking at, past what those appearances are. And, the appearances are positive, but it's how the details are hashed out is what really matters. And we don't have enough visibility on that right at this moment.
Something else that we are focused on right now is the fact that Ukraine joining NATO. So this is something that President Putin is really, focused on at this moment, that Ukraine will not join NATO. However, we have been hearing that NATO allies in those countries, they will offer certain security guarantees to Ukraine that would equal basically what they would get if they joined NATO. Now, why is it that President Putin is okay with this, but not the other option, which is Ukraine finally winning into that bid?
I'm not certain President Putin is on board with these security guarantees. I suspect this will be a point of contention. I don't think Putin is going to accept that. What we're hearing about the security guarantees is that would require NATO troops to be based in Europe, maybe not under the flag of NATO. It could be under the European Union. I suspect that any type of agreement would not permit say, nuclear weapons to be used, to be deployed in Ukraine, or it wouldn't allow Ukraine to be part of the nuclear shield. But look, I don't think the Russians are going to accept this whatsoever. This is what all gives me pause about these negotiations. The two sides are so far apart. And the reality is that the Russians, even though their advances are slow, they're unstoppable at this point. The Russians are eating the cow of Ukraine one small bite at a time, and these gains, they add up. So not only are the Russians winning the war territorially, they're gaining small amounts of ground each day, which adds up, but they're grinding down the Ukrainians. So the Russians don't have to cave into some of these demands, and these are my concerns. I just get the feeling we're not negotiating based on reality here. It's what everyone would like. Everyone wants peace. I don't know that Putin actually wants peace because he has the upper hand, but the U.S., NATO, Ukraine wants peace. Ukraine needs peace because it's losing on the battlefield. But wanting that and getting a deal that can actually make that happen, those are two very separate things.
All right, so let's say that we can get both sides to agree on a deal that would bring peace and stop this war in its entirety. What would come next then? What exactly would European countries, the U.S., have to do to really step up here, in support of Ukraine? And what would Ukraine do if that were to happen?
Yeah, that's all based on the security guarantees, and that's based on how what the Russians would permit. And again, I'm very pessimistic that the Russians are going to allow something like a European peacekeeping force on Ukrainian soil, or U.S. Troops on Ukrainian soil. And again, how does the issue of the territory, will the Russians accept that? But let's assume that the Russians accept this. I'm highly skeptical that they're going to do it. But then, look, the Europeans had a significant problem in maintaining small amount of forces in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan is essentially half a world away from Europe, whereas Ukraine is right on the border. But European countries do not want to spend on defense as is. What is the size of this peacekeeping force? What are its rules of engagement? These are all things that need to be decided. But I just can't see. One of the things I've heard is about 10,000, a token 10,000 man peacekeeping force in Ukraine. That front line is well over 500 to 600 miles long. That is just not enough. Those troops would merely be a tripwire. And then there's the concern of, could this lead to a direct war between the U.S. and NATO and Russia? No one is really discussing this. And part of my concerns here with a security guarantee is, let's face it, in the 25 years of the war on terror, 24 years, the U.S. has not acquitted itself well in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We've lost both of those wars. We've shown our allies that we're not committed. We just have a problem with long-term commitment. Our politicians deal in terms of election cycles, 2 and 4 years, where our enemies deal in terms of decades and generations. The Russians are there to stay. What is the U.S. will? And that's what the Europeans are dependent on the U.S. for any guarantee. What happens if the U.S. will to provide security breaks? We also had an agreement with Afghanistan, and we abandoned them.
Going off of some of the points that you made within that last answer, President Trump has spoken extensively about several of these conflicts that he has been able to resolve through U.S. intervention, whether it's through peace deals, through ceasefires, and all of those negotiations. What makes the conflict between Russia and Ukraine so unique in this aspect?
Yeah, the conflict, what we have, is we have a war in Europe, and that is something of great concern. I find it ironic that the U.S. is trying to play the peacekeeper while we're arming Ukraine, providing intelligence, providing training and support. In some sense, like I applaud the efforts of President Trump to bring peace, but in some respects, we're not an honest broker here. Nor are the Europeans. It almost seems like there needs to be a third party, but who is that? Obviously we wouldn't trust the Chinese, and I don't know that there is another country on the world stage that has the gravitas to try to arrange some type of deal between Russia and Ukraine. But this is important. We're talking about energy, and European dependence on energy. A lot of it comes from Russia. The Europeans are still buying billions upon billions of dollars of Russian petroleum products while it's supporting Ukraine in a war. So there's a lot of ironies. There's a lot of contradictions in this war that need to be sorted out. And I think this is why ultimately the Europeans want peace in Europe. They want stability. They want to be able to buy that cheap, sweet Russian petroleum products that keeps their industries running. So, yet they don't want to see Russia gobble up Ukraine and watch Russia become expansionist.
There's so many questions and so much to dive into with this topic, Bill. I promise I won't keep you that much longer, but it may be important to talk a little bit about the support that Russia is getting perhaps from other countries and other nations, because we're really focused on Europe backing Ukraine, also the U.S. here backing Ukraine. Who does Russia have?
Russia's primary ally in this is China. Now, no one is openly coming out and saying we support Russia, just like large portions of Europe and other countries are supporting Ukraine. The Russian support, or the support for Russia, is more subtle. It's more low key. So the Chinese are providing Russians with military equipment, with technology to build their drones, things of that nature, and low key political and diplomatic support. I guess the only really outward ally would be North Korea that has sent troops. Then you have countries like India and a whole host of countries, mainly third world or second world countries, that are buying oil from Russia on the black market, because these are countries that are looking to save money. India is paying a price for this politically with the Trump administration, which is levying tariffs on them. But, in some ways, these countries, they don't have a stake in this war. We could judge them whether it's right or wrong, whether they should be doing this. But looking at it from India's perspective, India's like, this is not my problem. I'm looking to purchase petroleum. So, and these type of issues, by the way, particularly, India should be a major ally of the United States in Asia and the Pacific. And unfortunately, an issue like this is driving a wedge between the U.S. and India.
Bill Roggio here, a senior fellow with the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We certainly appreciate your time this morning, breaking down really a topic that we would need several days to discuss in order to get the full scope of that. But we will be checking in with you soon. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Great to see you.